Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye, your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your humble host, DJ BJ Turnov, and you're listening to The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio. I expressed some sentiments on last week's episode that this show is an unabashed ripoff of Coast to Coast AM. You're damn right. Steve Jobs did once credit Pablo Picasso, one of the most influential 20th century artists, as saying, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." If it's good enough for those two geniuses, well, it's good enough for this crappy little tiny podcast. Like that same quote, the topic of tonight's conversation is both possibly rooted in older times and hotly debated whether Picasso is the true author. The story goes that Spaniard Pablo Picasso, who was also a lifelong resident of France for most of his adult life, supposedly visited either or both the caves of Altamira or Lascaux, the latter of which is considered to be the Sistine Chapel of prehistoric cave art. After Pablo gazed upon this ancient art for the first time, he exclaimed, "We have invented nothing." Then, purportedly shortly after viewing these ice cave illustrations, he completed a couple of his masterpieces, possibly copying, drawing direct inspiration from this ancient art. Did the father of modern art steal from ancient artists? What is the true meaning of the Paleolithic art found inside the caves? Author, naturalist, and thought leader Bernie Taylor chimes in on these mysteries, which is featured in his book, Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero, which we're going to explore in just a few minutes. This is The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio. We're back on The Mind's Eye. Bernie Taylor will be joining us shortly to answer one of the great art mysteries. But first, let me tell you a little bit about how researchers possibly solved an archaeological one about the Easter Island statues. Archaeologists have long pondered how some of the statues have stone hats and were placed upon them only by using 13th century tech. Using a combination of old techniques and 3D modeling, the answer has finally been found. In short, ropes and ramps guided by hands. Who would have thought, huh? Just like the paintbrushes guided by the artist of a mesmerizing new exhibition featured at the Caven Morris Gallery in New York's Lower East Side, all of the art featured is from artists who claimed that they were influenced by forces outside themselves and from spirits from the other side. View the art and archaeological answers featured in these articles. Visit our social media pages at Mind's Eye Show for Facebook and Twitter, or just go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. Again, themindseyemedia.com. Pick one or all of the platform. You'll also see information about tonight's guest, Naturalist Bernie Taylor, who will tell us if genius Pablo Picasso's own hands and mine were guided by the ancients. Did Picasso borrow actual Paleolithic cave images to help form his Cubism style? The answer awaits. We'll be right back in a Mind's Eye moment. Bernie Taylor, author of Before Orion, joins the Mind's Eye to frame his claim on one of the most hotly debated art and archaeological stories. Bernie, much obliged for a moment of your time tonight.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
I cannot wait to talk about this. And let's start with, what our main focus is. We're framing our conversation around Picasso and this hotly debated story and possible influences on some of his greatest works. And I want to talk a little bit about the man himself. He was fascinating. There's really no other way of putting it. He was one of the few historical great artists that were actually recognized in his own time. Picasso, he'd probably be the first one to tell you how much of a genius he was. In your chapter in the book, where we're going to be talking about, our main focus for the conversation, I don't really think you said too much about your personal opinion on the man himself. Where do you weigh in on Pablo?
So I see Picasso as a genius, but not for the reasons that most people do. What Picasso did, and we'll talk about it as we go through the program, is he borrowed metaphors and images from our Paleolithic past that he recognized that they're still in our minds. And so he reinvented the past. He captured our imagination. All modern art comes from Picasso, and it all comes from one painting, Les Dames d'Avignon, 1907. And he has two masks on female characters, and both those masks come directly out of the cave at Altamira, which Picasso had visited around 1900. So Picasso had been there. We have to see the exact same masks. And if you watch the Genius Picasso series on TV right now, National Geographic, they say that he was inspired by African masks, and he walked in some sort of gallery or museum, and he sees the mask, and they have some story about it. It's totally untrue, but that's okay. But because now we have a source that we can find that inspiration, and Picasso himself said he didn't borrow from the masks. They were there at the same time he and his friends were looking for inspiration, but Picasso never did say where he found the inspiration for that Les Dames d'Avignon, the two women's masks.
All right, well, let's paint the scene a little bit. You just painted a few broad strokes there. Tell us the story behind Picasso and the Ice Age cave art, when, where, all the good details, and then we'll really dive into some of the details and some of the larger implications. Absolutely.
In the late 1800s, the first big cave was found. It's called Altamira. It's in sort of the south of Spain. And there was a good movie starring Antonio Banderas, who also plays Genius Picasso. And in the story, the Antonio Banderas character is challenged that it's a fraud, it's a fake, so on and so forth. And the archaeologists said that he made it up. Later years, Picasso was said to have gone to Altamira, and he looked at the artwork, and he came out of it, and he said, none of us could have done anything like this. It was so far beyond not just these metaphors, but the artistic techniques of layering animals and so on, that it just wasn't. It wasn't in our art. And still, some of the images that I have in my book are so far beyond in artistic technique than anything we have in modern times, even in computer-generated graphics. So anyway, Picasso walks out of the cave and says, we've invented nothing, and none of us could have done anything like this. So he gave testimony. Well, there is testimony out there that Picasso had been to Altamira. And archaeologists and historians had actually looked into Picasso, and they tried to figure out if he did borrow from cave art. But they missed the few key characters in these caves that he actually – I don't want to say he stole it because he didn't. And I don't want to say he lifted it because he didn't. He was inspired by them. And yes, they are exactly ours. Les Dames d'Avignon, the masks are exactly the same as they are in Altamira. But he also carried this idea of the metaphor, the mares, of the female horses which lead, and he carried that into Les Dames d'Avignon as the female characters. So Picasso's brilliant, but just not for the reasons everybody thinks he is.
Well, I mean, it is art after all, and art is you're always stealing a little bit from someone for the most part, 99.9%, or I guess how you look at it is maybe paying homage. So I mean, it's just the nature of art. So I mean, and to get forward, you have to look at the past. So I don't think anyone's looking at it. So, but what you did say right there, I mean, you said a lot. I want to unpack all of that, take it bit by bit. And
sure.
Before, as we were talking about this story, and it's hotly debated, did he really say those things that he said? Did he really visit it? And before, I was trying to look for real tangible evidence, and I couldn't really find it, but you noted that there was some testimony. Can you go into a little bit of that? Because one of the things that when you hear this story and people debate it, everyone says, no, it didn't happen. It's just a story. There's no real evidence. Tell us, is there real evidence?
Well, there is no real evidence other than what people have carried on throughout the years.
Where did the story originate from then?
Well,
what's the axis point, the nexus?
The earliest access point that I saw was printed in National Geographic, but National Geographic took it on testimony of one of the guides that took him into the cave of Lascaux and Altamira. So we don't have Picasso didn't put in his journal, and he also doesn't. Picasso was a businessman, okay? He was a secretive. He must have had hidden notebooks somewhere. And what he did was he went at these caves, he drew them, and then he came back to put them into his artwork. But in one of the images, one of his most famous paintings is Guernica. Guernica, he disappears for a week. Before he's at a high point in the painting. He's moving along fairly quickly, and then he just disappears for a week. No one knows where he goes. And then when he comes back, he comes up with a new horse for Guernica, which is exactly the same as Grotte de Père non-Père in France. And he comes up with other characters, other metaphorical characters, the overlays in the same way that we find in Paleolithic art. And so Picasso doesn't tell us. Picasso died a multimillionaire, 30 million or so. He was a businessman. It was not his responsibility to tell us where he got his art. In fact, there's a quote from Picasso said, "If I'm not going to," he says, "I'm not going to tell you," in so many words, because that was his secret, a secret he took to his grave.
And symbolism is a really big part of art, and the quote that you're talking about, I think that's what it's in reference to. He wants the viewer to come with their own, I guess, interpretation from the symbols that he uses. And you talked about those different art that were influenced, particularly by these caves. Let's start with the masterpiece, Guernica. Since we're saying where he's not sealing, what parts would you say he appropriated from the cave?
He appropriated a few characters. Well, first thing he does is he's superimposing a Paleolithic cave scene over the war-ravaged Guernica that was attacked by the Nazis and the Italians at the same time from the air. So in the center of the image, we have a lamp carrier, someone holding a lamp, and we have a light at the top of the ceiling. Why would you need two in the same place? It's because he's superimposing. The lamp bearer is probably his guide going into the cave. On one side of the cave, we find a bull and we have a horse superimposed over it, which is a scene he does in many of his paintings before and after, which is fairly common in Paleolithic art, that they engraved animals on top of each other. It's hard to tell where one begins and the other starts. So on one side we have this the horse, and we have the bull. And Picasso said the bull was evil. He doesn't say who the characters are. In fact, he says the bull is evil, and so I would say the bull would be General Franco, and then the horse would be his companion Mussolini. And there's another character below them who I do not mention the name because Picasso didn't want the name to be mentioned. But there's a character that's in a dying child that has a wide-brimmed mustache and a corporal, like a Nazi corporal helmet from World War I. And below, so if there's a right to this, the fascists, there must also be a left. And I was thinking about it, and I said, well, what's on the other side of this panel? And deep into this, on the other side of the panel, let's call it the person inside the panel's left, is a bear. So the bear would be the symbol of the Russian bear, because Stalin, who was on the other side. And then we have this mare in the middle, and she's struggling. And Picasso said she represents the Spanish people. So you have the left and the right, the fascists and the communists fighting over Spain, and that's what the Spanish Civil War was about. And that is as he describes Guernica. So you have Picasso borrows these metaphors, and we still use metaphors, and we've probably used them for at least hundreds of thousands of years. We think of the nurturing mother bear, the protective mother bear, the bull in the china shop. The lead mare leads all the horses in the herd. We have all these characters that we continue to project. Someone can fly as high as an eagle and run as fast as a cheetah, these sort of things. We ourselves cannot break away from the concept of being animus, that we draw strength and inspiration from the animal beings in our world. And that's what Picasso is portraying. But he's portraying it as the emotional struggles, the conquering struggles between these people, as opposed to we trying to be as fast as a cheetah. It's the protective mother bear on one side, and we have the bull on the other. So Picasso was brilliant, and my hat's off to him. Now, Picasso, I believe that Picasso thought that someday someone was going to see this. And there's a famous quote that he had: "It is not sufficient to know an artist's works. It is also necessary to know when he did them, why, how, under what circumstances. Someday there will undoubtedly be a science It will be called The Science of Man, which will seek to learn more about man in general through the study of creative man. I often think about such a science, and I want to leave to posterity a documentation that will be as complete as possible. That's why I put a date on everything I do. So it's almost as he was speaking to us into the future, that somebody was going to stumble upon this. And I actually stumbled upon it as well.
And what similarities did you see from the art? I mean, have you actually been to the cave itself, I'm wondering? Because I noticed that you did have some pictures inside the chapter. Were those yours personally? Or
No, they weren't. The Altamira cave has been closed for many years. Those images were taken by professional photographers in the past, which is actually okay because I didn't doctor the pictures, which is, and these are images that came from public archaeological sources. So there's no one has actually challenged me on this so far, because people were struggling to find where Picasso found it, and they threw out the masks as an explanation. But no one ever found the masks that tie to these images. And you'd think that if these masks came out of museums and showrooms that Picasso had been to, someone would be able to make the connection. And no one has over all these years. So people were looking for explanations, and they settled on the African masks, even though Picasso himself said, I didn't use African masks. So it's I'm going to tell you. Can I tell you how I found this? It's kind of a unique story.
Please, of course. That's why you're on here, Bernie.
There's another image I work on in the book. It's called the Gorham etching, and the Gorham etching is in Gibraltar, and has been widely considered the abstract art of Neanderthal. It's not. There's lots of human and other characters in there, spiritual as well as animals. And in this Gorham etching, you have this character that is definitely not an animal. It's if you can imagine like the hound from hell with a spike coming down. Instead of a body has a spike coming down, and it's got this huge nasty jaw. It just isn't like anything that's possible. And so I started thinking about it. I said, well, this would fall perfectly into the modern horror, what we do in modern animation. And so I tried to figure out, well, was there a tie from the Paleolithic 34,000 years ago, this image, to of these ghastly type of characters? And there wasn't. So I asked an artist friend of mine, Luther Kelly Hall. He's in Mystic, Connecticut area. He's a brilliant artist. I said, through your work, where is the first kind of horror characters show up? And he says, as far as I know, it's Picasso, the Mask that led them to Avignon. And so I started looking at Picasso, and boy, it took me seconds to make the connection between many of these Paleolithic images and the style and so forth. And I bought the books, and I did the research, what other people had looked and seen, and they missed it. And I believe that some people missed it because they just weren't looking in the right places. I believe that some other people missed it because they were led astray. There was an archaeologist, Father Henry Breau, who was considered the father of prehistory. And the storyline that he had, or he needed to keep, was that there was not a transition from the distant past. And so many of the images that we can now see in photographs from these caves, that he was redrawing from the caves at that time, he gave his own interpretation of what he wanted the world to see or not. And he has these avenoid, there are avenoids or angel-like characters in these caves, and for some reason he misses them, but they're pretty darn clear when you look at the actual photographs from today. And I don't believe he missed them. I believe he hid them. Just the world wasn't ready for it. So these things were out there. Some people had seen them. Some people didn't because they're hidden or they didn't have the images. They were looking in the wrong places. Picasso has a lot of art, and there's tens of thousands of Paleolithic cave images. But I saw the style pretty quick of how he overlays the characters and recognized that is clearly what they do in Paleolithic art. And it was later on that I found the exact same images that he used, that he drew from, that he borrowed of sorts.
Why wouldn't he make note of such a huge inspiration? He doesn't want you to interpret maybe he wants you the viewer itself to interpret the symbolism, but why not get a better understanding by knowing the inspiration?
If I came up with some phenomenal mathematical formula today, or some vision of the stars, some constellations, and the scientific world was, oh my God, this guy's absolutely brilliant. But then I actually hadn't found that. I actually hadn't come up myself, but I borrowed it from the ancient Greeks, and I found it in some ancient Greek text. Okay. So Picasso was rolling on his ego. He was a businessman, so he had really no reason. But what he does is, in the early stages, he takes the actual images, he lifts them, and he borrows a few of them later down the road as well. But then he changes the style. What he does is, we can imagine a Janus figure. You have two faces going in opposite directions on the same head. Well, you can flip that around, and you can have kind of a Janus figure, two faces going in the same direction. In some of the earlier Picasso works, he has those two Janus figures that the faces are slightly different. And what he's describing is the two different personalities of this individual. Later, he transforms that to what we think of these grotesque, the huge noses and eyes in different places. What he's doing in those images through the remainder of his career is that he's showing two personalities within the same character. And sometimes it's himself. And most often the women in his life, he's expressing the multiple people that he sees inside of those individuals, and he overlays them one over the other and kind of slightly offsets them, just as we see in Paleolithic cave images. We have horses on top of horses, of bulls on top of horses, and mammoth and so on. And what Picasso is brilliant, he recognizes that this is wired in our brain to interpret that we can figure it out. Even if we don't know where it came from, our mind can reason somewhere deep and make sense of all this. And so Picasso, as wacky as some people might think his artwork is, they can still connect to it. They can still, even if they don't understand, these are actually two different personalities. If they can't verbalize that, their mental processes can still recognize it. And that was part of the genius of Picasso.
What would you say in particular that you love about Picasso? I just want to get personal for you, because, from just the hearing you sound, you're clearly a huge fan.
Well, I didn't start off as a huge fan. I started off, this guy stole his artwork. That's all I'm going to tell you right now. And I have a really good friend, Jake Yeager, who is an artist. I have a lot of artist friends. And, Jake said to me, first I showed him the Picasso stuff, and Jake says, in the old days, we didn't have photographs. We used to go out in nature and actually, paint what we saw. But then Jake read the chapter later on and says, we didn't actually, he said, but we didn't steal it either. Okay. So Jake kind of had that. Picasso, I believe that Picasso is working on some of the same concepts that I am, that where does humanity come from? Do we keep reinventing things? And how did we initially come about these ideas? And here's another Picasso quote. Okay. It occurred to man to create his own images. It's because he discovered them in the world around him, almost formed, already within his grasp. He saw them in a bone, in the irregular surfaces of cavern walls, in a piece of wood. One form might suggest a woman, another a bison. He's telling us. He saw these images in the caves, and there were irregular surfaces that they put charcoal around to give us a horse. And then Picasso interpreted that horse. He took that horse and he made it into a woman. Picasso, through his quotes in the many interviews he had over time, he tells us what he does, but not the details of what he does. And so Picasso really, Paleolithic art emerged about 40,000 years ago, and there's some older ones now, about 65,000 years. But there's still work that's being done on that. So about 40,000 years ago, Paleolithic art emerges. Why do we do this? Why do we have this great leap forward that creates all the art that we have today? And so Picasso says that they saw these images in the bone and the regular surfaces and in the rocks. There's a quote of, I believe it's Michelangelo, and he says he had a piece of marble and he wanted to set David free. And It's, I believe that Picasso had the same, he recognized the same thing about Paleolithic man, and he himself had a very unique eye that he could recognize the forms and the shapes that others ordinarily didn't. And he brought that out to the world, and he reinvented the past. There's people, I believe they're Hermetics, and they believe that there's many different peoples that believe there's cycles of time, and that we keep reinventing our past. And they believe that they're in 30,000 and 100,000 million year cycles, these sort of things. I believe that we do reinvent the past. I believe there's very few new ideas. Microelectronics, of course, is, but in art, in sociology, in literature, and mythology, as I express through my book and share through all the different examples, that we do carry these stories from the past. We have invented nothing. Okay, culturally haven't invented anything, and we just keep finding the past and reinventing the themes that were, from cavemen.
I want to talk a little bit more about the past and the real inspiration for Picasso. But let's go take a quick break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk more about Picasso and the ice cave art. This is The Mind's Eye. We're back with Bernie Taylor talking about his book, Before Orion, and Picasso and his inspiration from ice cave art. Let's focus on these inspirations for Picasso. Who were they? Tell us about them. Tell us about a little bit more about the ice cave art. What was their purpose? I mean, and describe some of the pictures. I mean, from my understanding, there was a lot of animals. Why would there be so many animals as well?
Good question. From my perspective, how I see it, the interpretation is that the animals were beings in the world that they expressed on the cave walls. But there's also myths. And I've in this panel of discs in the El Castillo cave, I show that there's across a 10-meter panel, there's a myth that we still have today of Hercules. And to the north of Hercules, we have Hercules constellation. In the south, we have Orion. And as he moves along this panel, he encounters animals. First, an eagle, which is a Gia, and then he comes across the horse, the Pegasus. He has a dolphin, which becomes Pisces, and then Cetus the seal is next. And we hit Orion as hits again. He has Gemini in this head of a Barbary ape, the two eyes. The two major stars in Gemini. Then he has Leo, the lion, and we have Ursa Major. Then going up, we have this now extinct great auk, which is Cygnus, the constellation. In this particular image, he's telling a story going from Spain in the north to Africa in the south. And in the south, at the end where Orion is also a giraffe, a mother giraffe who's got her young wrapped around her neck, and her chin is over, or muzzle is over the top of the young. It's an empathetic scene. So we're seeing a story of a journey, of the hero's journey that of course we know through Star Wars, which emanated from most recently from the work of Joseph Campbell, and before him Carl Jung. And we have this journey from the north to the south, and the animals that he finds in his terrestrial environment are mirrored into the sky above him. So the constellations that we know today come from this Paleolithic record. The Greeks, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and others went to these caves, and they borrowed the images that they saw. They already had some constellations, but they borrowed these images, and they created this night sky that we have, that we see today, or that we project for our own psyche. I gave a presentation about 3 weeks ago at the University of Hawaii Institute for Astronomy. So those are all high-powered astronomers who actually look in telescopes that are larger than our homes. And I went through this presentation, and at the end they said, these guys 35,000 years ago had such advanced astronomy. Where did they get it from? Okay. And now the Greeks and the Romans and Phoenicians and so on, they lifted it, just as Picasso lifted from the Paleolithic image. These ancients in the Mediterranean also lifted it from the Paleolithic. And we know, but we have a record of the ancient Greek Ptolemy, He lived in Alexandria. We have a record of his 48 constellations that he found somewhere, and he is often considered to be the genius of astronomy, but it's not exactly what happened. Just like Picasso is a genius of modern art, Ptolemy borrowed from the past as well, from people who had information for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years before them. So in this, are there cycles of time where civilizations destroyed and all that sort of stuff? I'm not convinced, but I'm convinced that we have these archetypes within us. When the archetypes are counted, the stories are evoked. So when we see this panel with Hercules and Orion and all the animals around it, we can recognize that it's a man on his journey. When we can see him swimming with the dolphins and the other, we can see him climbing a mountain. We can see him doing all these things as a man would do on his journey. At the end, we have Orion. He actually holds his club, and it looks just like Luke Skywalker in the early movies, where he holds his lightsaber above his head, and there's a woman Leah's just down to his left. And in this image, we have this Orion character holding the club, and there's a woman just down to his right. And so we have these images in us. Jung found that the two most common non-organic archetypes were the mountain and the body of water. If you ever you've done art in your past, and you probably drew a river and a mountain behind it. We seek to climb mountains and cross rivers. It's just something in our psyche. And I believe that it harkens back to these original images, perhaps even a time before them. Because on this journey from the north to the south, we're going from Spain across the Strait of Gibraltar to Africa. We've crossed the river. And on the other side, he actually climbs Jebel Tobakal. We could now call it Jebel Tobakal, which the mountain the Greeks called Atlas. And so the ancient Greeks and the Phoenicians and the Romans and the Egyptians were retelling a story from a distant past. And we still retell that story. Maybe we've changed some of the characters' names, but it's still the hero on his journey, his archetypal journey. And we counter all these experiences. Instead of the Greeks saw the seal as a sea monster, which they kind of upped the game. And we find aliens or some other things in the night sky too, or all kinds of other monsters out there. But these things go back to a far distant time, and I'm not going to tell you that we have these tremendous cycles, but there are tremendous geniuses that have been in our past, just as we have tremendous geniuses now, and they leave their record to us, and we keep borrowing that record and reinventing it and calling it our own, which is exactly what Picasso did. But Picasso took it another level. He just didn't take these cave images and put them on a piece of paper, so transform a horse to a bull and overlap them. He took the metaphors, these characters of his time, which is the bull of Franco and the Italian stallion of Mussolini and the bear of Stalin. And then, of course, the mayor from Guernica right in the middle. So he took it many steps further.
You touched on a lot of good points there, and how we've been influenced from our past. And we're talking about the inspiration from the ancient times. And we could see that the people, that drew in these caves, some of these images are striking. You noted how constellations, we had to get that information from somewhere. We know that agents were able to track them as well. Yet, even to this day, although in more recent time it seems that we're veering away from this perspective, although I think still it's historically looked at in the text, we look at the ancients as primitive. And I think that's quite reductive after everything that we've seen over the past few years. Yet we still, on many levels, still kind of forward that notion. Why do you think we reduce them when there's so much reduce the ancients when there's so much evidence of the opposite?
Well, there's different peoples. We have these Paleolithic cave artists, which prior to my work, there really was no nuance at all found in their work. Okay, so if we go to the ancients in the Mediterranean, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on, they told their stories as we believe to be myth, and they went to these caves and they saw the man being lifted. Orion character being lifted by the dolphin. They saw the man transforming himself into the horse and the eagle, which becomes Pegasus. And they saw these things. The ancient Greeks saw these, and they said this must be real, and they told stories about them. But they told stories that also had meaning to them. They told they had social constructs embedded in them for people to learn about themselves through the heroes and the characters. So when we look back at these stories, we say, that's all myth and so on. But they were telling the stories just as we share stories on the big screen today, or of course we now stream them. They're the same stories, they're the same themes, and we probably have even more absurd, imaginative characters in our stories than the Greeks and the Romans ever could have imagined. But we call that fiction, whereas to the Greeks and the Romans, the Phoenicians, it was real. And they went to these caves, and they must have seen these things and been absolutely amazing. And they must have thought that at a time before them, there were centaurs, the man who becomes one with the horse, and mermaids and so on. The female character becomes one with the dolphin. So the ancient Greeks must have looked back and said, this must have been real in the past. We don't really see it now, but we can tell these stories of the past. And just as we have taken the stories again now from the ancient Greeks and so forth, and put our own spin on them, we don't. This great hero's journey with Luke Skywalker is to go from one planet to another, and the great sea that he crosses is space. And he goes into that faraway land, and he meets all these unusual characters, and he's mentored by Obi-Wan and Yoda, which are these are archetypal characters we find in myths throughout the world.
That we do get these archetypal characters, and they're transferred across and transmitted across cultures and time, space, through stories, through art, even in our dreams. I mean, what's the larger implication of this, and why is it so important that we probe into these archetypal characters?
Well, we're going to step back, because I have a different interpretation on archetypal characters than probably anybody else in the cosmos, and through this own work, there's I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have the Oregon Zoo near us. And it's a fabulous complex, and there's lions. There's an older male. There's a few females, and then there's a young male. The young male is always at the bottom of the rocks. The older male is at the top, and the females kind of in and around the middle. Well, those lions, many generations ago, were in the wild, and they're fed. There's nothing that for those lions to continue to have this hierarchical structure. How did the lions know to do that, and why do they continue to do it? Well, the male lion is obviously the patriarchal figure, and among the females, there's a matriarchal figure in there as well as let's say an alpha female or a beta female, and then so the lions themselves recognize archetypal characters within them in their societal structure. Okay. And you see those other animals in your life all the time, but we don't generally see them as archetypes, but they truly are. So when we've just got a bigger story. These archetypes go back to a distant point when we were animal beings, and they're on chimpanzees. Chimpanzees don't tell stories, but they have all these archetypal characters within their society. And that was first demonstrated by the work of Jane Goodall, to the amazement of the world that there's like societal structure among chimpanzees. But they don't tell the stories. The difference is that we tell the stories. We take the stories of these animal beings in and around our lives, we borrow the metaphors, and we project them as our own to express something that we want to say about society or personally of ourselves. So why are these archetypes so important? Because they harken back to the earliest forms of man, when we can first start telling stories. And I believe the first stories that were told were about the animals in the world, but then they were projected to the night sky as constellations. And as we see with these cave images that are, they are the constellations as the ancient Greeks saw them. You go around, they're exactly. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing. And so it's part of us. And we still use these archetypes. Someone is as smart as an owl. Someone is as fast as a cheetah and strong as an ox. We express ourselves through these archetypes, which are fundamentally animist in nature.
Well, let's bring it contemporarily and outside of the use of metaphors. I mean, what are some of the archetypes that you see that are the main ones that you see in some of our major forms of art today, and what is that indicative or reflective of today's society?
So I'm not well versed in other than Picasso. Okay, I'm not that well versed in modern art.
No, it doesn't even have to be art. Well, it could be movies. It could be, movies. Because that's it's a big major form of art today. What do you see are some of the major reoccurring characters?
Well, for movies and stories, you have typically a choice of a person goes on a journey or a stranger enters the room. Okay, so something has changed to make it interesting. Otherwise, it's just someone sitting in a room drinking iced tea that they've been doing for years. So there has to be some change in that life. So that's a fundamental archetypal story. In these archetypal stories, we always have the helper, a spiritual helper. Of course, it's Obi-Wan and Yoda in Star Wars. But in all movies throughout all stories throughout time, there's typically an older person who comes to the help of the younger, and maybe that person has magical abilities, maybe not, because it might be just the person might be given words of wisdom, which is strength in itself. So we have that type of character. We have the damsel. This is an interesting one. Historically, we had the damsel in distress and the male hero, but Disney has, in a modern social construct, Disney and other movie producers have switched that the male character might be the evil one, and the female might be the hero. So of course we have that with Pocahontas and Moana. You just go down the list of Disney princesses or female characters now. So we've in this time, in this place, we've come up with a new social construct of archetypal characters. We switch the male and the female, but in the end, we still have the characters themselves. And in these Paleolithic images, we have most of these animals are female. So my sense is that when the hero goes on his journey, he's assisted by the female of the species versus the males of the species. And so these female animals become the horse and the eagle and so on, become his spiritual helpers. And so it's matriarchy and strong female characters are not a new thing today, but we've been reinvented from the past. But it's something different than we had, of course, in the 1960s Bond movies, where it was predominantly a strong male and he saves, or actually usually tries to save the blonde or the brunette or whatever he called them, and usually didn't go well for the women.
Does this change the way that these archetypes are viewed? I mean, will that change how maybe the psychology of them, of how we look at them in the future?
Yeah. So this is it does change the psychology of how we look at everything in the future, because this is the first time that we have actual evidence, and it's just, you can't argue about this. You can see the giraffe, you can see all these animals, and we can see the hero on his journey. We can see all the constellations. This isn't rocket science. You don't need a lot of imagination to see this. So this is the first time in the modern history of man that we have these images or a story that we can trace back to of course, the ancient Greeks, and then to people 34,000 years ago.
By switching the gender roles, does that affect the way that we could view them in the future? Like, does that affect our psychology and how we think of archetypes in the future by switching the gender roles?
No. It goes back to, let's say, each society. There are many matriarchal societies where the female is the hero. And I lived in China for a number of years. In the south of China, there's a matriarchal society where the women went around to choose who their husband would be. So that's not a new thing. Among Native Americans, the men may have been chiefs, but the women were making decisions around the campfire, and that's a common type of thing. So just because we have the figurehead as the male, it's not always the male. It's not always the males are not always running the show. But so do we. We have come up with a new social construct in Western society that, of course, we don't have in Afghanistan or Iraq or these other places which are working on an older Abrahamic tradition. So we in our modern world we've changed things that we've made it more it's become more egalitarian. We can have females as heroes, and we support that. But it might change in 10 years. We might have something completely different.
What about with religion? How does being religious or how does each religion view archetypes?
Here's a very example. So the horse is Pegasus, and Pegasus is who the Greeks found to be Pegasus, who is flown by Bellerophon up to Mount Olympus, and Pegasus throws him off, Bellerophon off. The winged horse is found in the Abrahamic tradition that Muhammad flies the winged horse to heaven. Abraham has a wife and a mistress, and he flies back and forth on the same horse. Okay, so we have the horse, the spirit. This horse takes the hero on his transformative journey. And of course, for Muhammad, it's going to heaven. And for Bellerophon, it's going to Mount Olympus, but he's not ready to climb that highest mountain, so he's thrown off. And of course, again, we go back to that archetypal mountain, Mount Olympus. So we have these characters, archetypal characters, throughout in our myths, and we can't escape from them. And I would say that the reason we have in all the myths around the world, just as Joseph Campbell said, is that there was a common root. And the common root, it's deeper than this cave 34,000 years ago, and perhaps others before them. They're in the myths that were told through stories and were charted through the night skies. And the constellations are our greatest storyboard. And as the stars move throughout the seasons, we can tell new versions or new parts of the myth. So the myths are carried through the constellations and stars. So these archetypes, they're in all of the religions. There's a great hero, whether it be Krishna or Muhammad or Jesus. I mean, you name your hero who gives him or herself to find something within ourselves to set that he gives him his life to set society free. But of course, society never gets set free because we keep having these new heroes, these new prophets. So we continue, and that's not my idea. That's Joseph Campbell and other people, mythologists. So we will always have religions, and whether or not we call them that way. And if we don't call them religions, we're going to call them movie cults or something like that, or people who follow the literature. Because we express society, we have many ways to express society norms. One of them could be through religions. Other that could be a reading or writing of books. Another would march in movies or telling our stories to our kids about, using metaphors to express who we are and where we should be as a culture.
And all this is featured in Bernie's book, as we were saying before Orion. And you explore it in the Picasso. What we've talked about is just one aspect of this larger conversation. And I know it's been out for a little bit of time. Can we expect a sequel after Orion? What do you see, where do you see your research going from here on out?
When you get to the end of the book, you recognize that I have no more book to write. And so throughout this book, I'm telling my hero's journey. I'm giving the story of my hero's journey. And in the hero's journey, at the end, the hero shares what he's learned through the experience, that information to set society free. And I'm explaining Picasso, and I show the Paleolithic images and things about the Greeks and the Egyptians and so on. And I go finally to that point of origin, where we found many of these ideas. where we were able to project them from our minds into the cosmos. And there's really no book that I could write after this. I mean, it's just there's no place to go. When you see the final chapter, it's like, just what do you do? But what I would like to do is write documentaries, and this is set up for like Disney. I mean, you get all these animated characters, and you have these heroes, and I would foresee over time being some sort of documentaries. I give a lot of presentations. I gave one to astronomers, a few weeks ago. I gave it to college students in anthropology. I do a lot of podcasts, and all the podcasts I do are they're different spheres. They're scientists. There's introspective people such as you and your readers. I've done some comedy shows. It's really all over the board because these metaphors, these archetypes are within every part of our culture, and not just, I don't mean just Western culture, but around the world. We can't escape them. And so what I love doing is sharing my hero's journey story through all these components, as opposed to reading 18 chapters. And tonight we had the chance to explore the Picasso component, how I came to make these connections, and what I learned about Picasso, and ultimately learned about what we learned about ourselves, which is more important than Picasso's love lives. It's a fascinating journey, and that's what I love sharing.
So you're going to tell us what you did learn, your hero's journey, or you're going to make us read the book, is what you're saying?
You have to read the book, yeah.
Oh, fine.
You have to take the journey. You can't escape it, because you won't appreciate where we are until you've actually taken the steps, and it's amazing. And you really can't read the last chapter unless you've gone through the book and learned all the pieces. Just as there's a punchline and a joke, but you have to have learned what builds up to it. And in any great story, you have to have learned the characters before you get to the end. Otherwise, the end really has no meaning. And in that moment, when you're standing there in that mountain, and that is the mountain that you ultimately climb, your cosmic mountain of faith, you will be in tears, and you're just going to cry, and you're just going to say to yourself, is this really possible? It's sort of like the first Planet of the Apes with the character Taylor, Charlton Heston. He sees the world, his past, his world had been destroyed when he's looking at it was New York or something, and he just cries and sees that we're just rebuilding upon ourselves. And where this takes us, where the journey will take you, is beyond your imagination, but it's someplace you've always been, and that's the most striking part of this whole thing.
I hope to be blubbering like a little baby by the end of your book then, quite frankly. I'll also call you on Skype so that you can also watch me cry as well. Have a little fun for the next time. But tell our listeners where they can get more information about you and the book and get their hands on the sequel, Middle Dipper. No, I'm kidding. Before Orion, of course.
Sure. Before Orion, Find a Faithful Hero is available on ebooks in every format that's possible. It's an ebook because we need to save trees. I see this book being around for 1,000 years, and what the heck's the point of having a print book? My webpage is BeforeOrion.com. I use hashtag BeforeOrion on everything. You can follow me on Twitter, Bernie Taylor OR, and Instagram, Before Orion, Facebook page, Before Orion. There's lots of images out there. I use BeforeOrion.com for YouTube, and there's a bunch of videos, and on the playlist there's other interviews which have different foci. So BeforeOrion.com is one word. If you type that into YouTube, you'll find these videos. And Brian, thanks for having me on your program. It's been a lot of fun.
Truly thought-provoking material you're coming with, Bernie. Definitely coming at it from a different angle, something that we've explored in the past, and really thank you for giving us a mind's eye moment.
We'll do another one another day. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Hold on right there. We got to put the lacquer on tonight's colorful show when the Mind's Eye Mummy wrap-up returns. It's the Mind's Eye Mummy wrap-up. So was Picasso or cavemen the real genius? We can only guide you. As always, you must be the judge. If you love art and archaeology, obviously you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have stuck through this whole show by now. Then you got a hundo percento visit our Instagram page at Mind's Eye Show. I just posted a few pictures from the recent King Tut exhibition that I visited at the California Science Center. You hear about the beauty of ancient Egyptian art, but it's totally different seeing in person. You can get a little peek. Again, go to our Instagram page at Mind's Eye Show. And that's one of the reasons why I love living in LA. You get access to the best exhibitions in the world. Definitely one of the reasons why I'm going to miss the city, because I am going to be moving to Baltimore. Wait, what? I know I just moved to LA a couple of years ago, but my sister had some miracle twin babies, and I want to be closer to my new nephew and niece, Maddie and Thomas. Hello, hello. Can't wait to see you two. Which means, as you guessed by now, there won't be shows for a couple months. Yes, even after we've already had the lowest output of any recording year so far. Shut the hell up. But when we do come back in a couple months, we'll be on full blast, and I promise I will do my best to catch up average-wise, so you can expect an explosion of episodes. But wait. Let me give you a little bit more of the plan, and also a way to convince you to join our new Instagram page. Part of that big move to Baltimore is also fulfilling a lifelong dream of mine of a cross-country trip across America. That trip's going to start in 2 weeks, so make sure you join our Instagram page beforehand, again, at Mind's Eye Show, because we're going to be posting pictures along the way. Redwoods, Rushmore, Yellowstone. We'll be inspired by the beauty and oddity of America together, because inspiration exists. It just has to find you working, and action is the foundational key to all success. Let's be inspired and be successful together. I'm your humble host, DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for the Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.